our perspective that we're talking about right now is to be humble and not to add another stressor onto your life about following the top 10 tips of how to get through a day through establishing another regimented routine on top of this regimented routine of work
Yeah,
and life balance.
I'm a bit conflicted about all the discussion we see in recent years about the importance of resilience. And I do workshops on resilience, and I'm big on resilience like everybody else is. But at the same time, sometimes working on resilience can be a cover for not facing vulnerability, for not facing the fact that we do have things that we grapple with and that are not going to immediately be resolved if we just do some kind of resilience practices. If we live our lives like a Navy SEAL, so goes the online wisdom, then everything will be fine. And I'm not sure really that's the best approach for most of us.
Curious about your perspective on that topic is the concept of kind of the analytical mind versus the heart mind, or the cognitive empathy versus hard empathy. And I just find that so much in modern day world, including the counseling psychology field, is consumed with the analytical side of life. And I'm in a choir culture where obviously analytical mindsets is the key to survival and black and white thinking. But what I hear you say is maybe entice a view of reality that involves a shade of gray through all of this.
Well, I don't want to go too far down the track of questioning the direction of modern psychology, because that's a really big area and it's very interesting to me. But if I were to kind of summarize what I hear in your question, it's about the fact that we get a lot of messaging about the analytical side, the cognitive side, the thinking self, and the role that the thinking self can play in managing our lives. And there is definitely a role for the thinking self, absolutely, of course. What tends to get lost is that this messaging comes out of the culture of psychology, culture of mainstream psychology that's evolved over the last 30 or 40 years, that was in many ways a response to the previous age of psychology that was much more focused on symbology, symbols, mythology, the so-called deep self or the authentic self, ideas from storytelling and culture, on creativity. And so psychology kind of always goes in these cycles. And for the last generation or so, there's been a lot of emphasis on the cognitive side. There's no evidence, of course, that cognitive approaches are better than other approaches or should be the gold standard for anything. That's just kind of things that we hear and that people from within those domains say. But the evidence doesn't bear that out at all. The evidence bears out that people are different and different things work for different people. And some people don't respond that well to cognitive approaches. They prefer a more interpersonal or a more organic kind of approach to their well-being. So I think it's unfortunate in a way that we're in an age where when people think about how to deal with struggle and suffering, they often start with the question of how I think in my head. And they often also start with neurology, which is a similar kind of mistake. What I see in my work, and I'm sure you do as well, is that many people are looking for meaning and purpose and ways to deal with a kind of vulnerability or a kind of suffering that is persistent and long term. If you have a family member who's struggling with a mental illness, this is not something that you will fix because you learn how to be more cognitively resilient. This is something that's going to be a long-term struggle for everyone. And it's going to go in stages, and it will have different flavors and different moods. And over time, it will get better, and then it will get worse. And it's something you'll be grappling with. If you have the experience of trauma as a child, as many, many people do, this is not something that will go away because you have some thoughts in your head about how you won't think about it. It's something that's there. It's a part of you. It's deeply in who you are. It has a deep meaning in your life. And so many people sense this, and they sense that the role of trauma is much deeper than simply a wound that we have to bear. Trauma has a kind of potential wisdom hidden inside of it. The wound itself is a kind of call, a kind of invitation for self-discovery. And Of course, it doesn't feel like that when you're traumatized. It feels terrible and you want this thing to never have happened. But most people who recover and do well as a result of going through a trauma, they talk about meaning and purpose and the ways in which trauma can become a teacher for them. And all of those people, when they describe this, what they also describe is a kind of final surrender to the inner life, a surrender to the fact that you have to go inward and you have to explore that heart space that you mentioned, that emotional space. I always find it really interesting that psychology has, counseling too, that both fields have moved more in this direction of cognition, as we've said, when the research about human behavior that's happened in other fields like economics has shown that our cognition really has very little to do with our behavior. Our behavior is run by the emotional life, completely run by the emotional life. And cognition comes in later to rationalize the decisions we make. I mean, all of the decisions we make are emotional. And then later we say, oh, well, I made that decision for a rational reason. But that's not the case. And this has been exhaustively researched by a whole bunch of people. So emotions matter. And emotions are not the kind of thing you can put in a box and you can just say, I'm going to think this away, or I'm going to think this into a box that won't disturb me. And so we're used to, with regular daily life, putting things in boxes and just moving on. But right now, when we're in a situation where we might be forced to slow down and confront some things, the cognitive put it in a box method's probably not your best approach, right? An example that I think of is couple and family life. Many people have a relationship and they have children, one or both of those things, and there's something about those relationships that is always a bit off for everybody. Everybody has struggled in their intimate relationships, and intimate relationships require basically full-time attention to the quality and depth of the relationship. We get in these habits where some of the things that are fractured or broken in the relationships we don't deal with because we can just go to work, or we can just distract ourselves, or we can just pretend everything's okay, and once a year we'll go on holiday somewhere and we'll blow off steam and everything will be fine. But we know underneath the surface that there's some stuff we should probably deal with. And we're able to go for a long period not dealing with things because of the busyness of modern life. But perhaps now in this moment where we're not so busy, there might be opportunities to gently, carefully extricate some of that stuff, to explore, okay, maybe we could just be a little more open to dealing with or thinking about or making meaning about some of these underlying issues that we all face.
And I know that you've done a lot of work with Stoic populations, particularly men that may not be open to receiving counseling. And in a lot of ways, paramilitary work culture really attracts a type of individual that doesn't feel comfortable with expressing their true inner feelings, and to the point where they may not be aware of what a lot of their underlying feelings are about their daily reality. I'm wondering what your experience is in terms of enticing Stoic populations to start thinking about the deeper meaning behind their reality, and maybe looking at the intimacy side of their relationship from an emotional standpoint.
Yeah. One of the things that I was really struck by when I was involved in research at the 9/11 Museum with first responders was that for some of them, talking about the experience of 9/11 and the connecting to the emotion of 9/11 and being a first responder in the context of 9/11, that was easy. That was doable because it was meaningfully connected to the work and to the deep sense of meaning of the work during that time and for all times. When the conversation would shift to other things like family or children or addiction or personal mental health legacy of 9/11, that was a lot harder. And most people were not comfortable in that arena. It took them into an arena where they were much more guarded, much more careful. And I was really struck by that because it's not so much that, in my experience, First responders, especially male first responders, it's not so much that they can't connect to their emotions. It's that the routes to connection are constrained to only very specific areas about their work and the meaning of their work. And that's safe. It's safe to be emotional about your work, and to feel pride in your work and to feel that it's meaningful. But to talk about how some of the shadow sides might be there, or to talk about some of the unintended consequence of doing this kind of work, that stuff is really hard. And I've seen various things there in terms of how to help with that. One of them is to recognize that this culture is not going to change overnight. Doing a couple of workshops on emotional vulnerability is not going to change the situation. This is a really deeply set pattern in our society, especially for men in general. And first responder men are kind of way far down that spectrum of how we think about stereotyping men, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is a multi-generational project to try to be more organic and more honest about the emotional lives of men. And with men in general, we're not helping in our society very much. We have a situation with many men now where they feel that the question of what it is to be a man in the modern age is uncertain.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean to be a man now? The traditional roles of men have been dismantled. Thankfully, I think that's a good direction for us to go as a society, to not silo the roles of people by gender. I think that's positive. But one unintended consequence of that is that many men feel like they don't know how to express their maleness now. What does that mean? It's not acceptable anymore for men to be strong or aggressive, or to be taking charge, those kinds of things that traditionally and stereotypically have been male. And like I said, I think these are good developments, and our society is moving in the right direction as we make them. But it's easy to miss that for men who have built their lives based on those models, and to have those models suddenly taken away from them, at least that's their experience, that's how it feels to them, has been very disorienting. And so they can get lost in this struggle of how do I be a man in the world today? And for some of them, the anxiety about that leads to an unconscious attempt to reassert the old forms, to reassert and preserve this old notion of what it is to be a man. So to be dismissive of emotions, or to be flippant about personal vulnerability, to deny personal vulnerability. So one of the things I see in first responder communities is this kind of divergence between some people who are trying to hang on to the traditional modes, and some people who are trying to cultivate a newer, more organic, more sensitive approach. And it's interesting to see this kind of divide happening. And I think this will play out over the next generation or two, at least.